here today to talk about the lesser-known paper mills of Cumberland County. This is kind of a spin-off. I did a book on the paper mills of Mount Holly Springs, and there were, of course, 3 mills in what is now the borough of Mount Holly, and one just outside of town. And in the process of doing that, I started to bump into other paper mills that became, to me at least, kind of interesting and kind of fascinating. So we'll cover those today. There is a book available, or a booklet, at History on High called The Lesser Known Paper Mills of Cumberland County that goes into perhaps just a tad more detail. But to set the stage...
Sorry, I'm trying to make it a little darker up front without making it too dark.
Altogether, there were 9 paper mills in Cumberland County, which kind of surprised me. I didn't realize that they were that plentiful. 3, as I said, were located in Mount Holly Springs, and 6 were scattered about the rest of Cumberland County. And they didn't all exist at one time. Their years of operation varied. But one thing they all had in common is there's very little documentation on any of them. And what we have today is, I think, probably what exists. So we'll go through those. Just to give you a quick overview of what we're going to talk about, the first mill in operation is Duckett's Mill in Southampton Township, Cumberland County, a little bit north of Lee's Crossroads or Leesburg. That operated from 1795 to 1801, very early in terms of paper production in America and also in Cumberland County. Then, as we'll see with the rest, in the 1850s, we start to manufacture paper out of straw fiber, and I'll explain that in a second. But at that point, we see a mill at Middlesex from 1850 to 1885, Zugg's Mill, which is outside of Mount Holly. It's behind Hollyhurst on Ladner Lane, if you've seen that horse farm there. The Big Spring Mill at North Newton. Middle Spring at Southampton near the Middle Spring Presbyterian Church.
You're saying South Middleton, that's Southampton.
From Middle Spring to Southampton, yes. I'm sorry, my mistake.
You said that twice.
Did I? Okay. Thanks. And Trindle Springs, which was in Silver Springs Township. Again, fairly late again, 2 after the war. Now we talk about paper manufacture, and I went into fairly great detail on this when I did the paper mills of Mount Holly program, but paper is a slurry of water and fiber. And the fibers are dissolved to the point that we release individual fibers, put them in a solution, a very liquid solution. We take that solution and deposit it on a wire screen, and as the water drains out, the fibers orient and lock in place, and then as we dry it, it produces paper. Now there's 3 substances that we can use as fiber sources. Early paper was made of linen and cotton rags, which would go into what we call machines or beaters that tore the fabric apart and dissolved it into the individual fibers. By the 1850s, the technology had been perfected to take straw and process it mechanically to release the fibers. And that will produce what we call straw board. In the old days, straw board was used to make cardboard, or when I was a kid, straw board was used to make cardboard, and a lot of items that were imported from Japan at that time came in a yellowish, cheap cardboard. That was straw board, as opposed to a higher grade corrugated board that would be made in America. Then by the 1870s into the 1880s, we started to perfect the process of withdrawing fibers from wood, and we start to get into wood paper. Now, when we talk about linen and cotton rags, that makes an extremely high quality, durable paper, and there's no acids or chemicals used in that processing, so it tends to last a very long time. And if you go into our archives, you can go back to the late 1700s, early 1800s, and find paper that was made then that's still quite good. Straw paper was used primarily for wrapping paper in businesses. They didn't have paper bags till after the turn of the century, so they used straw paper as wrapping paper. It was cheap, and they also made straw board that was used to make boxes, also hat bands, and then we get into the wood paper. The wood pulp extraction process uses a lot of acid, and that's why, for example, when we look at more modern papers, they turn brown, they disintegrate, and their quality breaks down with time because of the acids and the chemicals that are left in that paper. Very chemical intense process. So this is the layering. We're going to be in the first and second. We never get into wood pulp manufacture in the county. The two existing mills today do use wood pulp, but they buy it from outside the state to manufacture
They
paper.
use sawdust.
Not sawdust, they use more chips to extract, it's lignin that they extract out. Now, straw paper, as I said, was developed in 1828, was in widespread use by the 1850s. If you read the history of paper, some accounts will say that the process was invented in western Pennsylvania, and the Shryock's in Chambersburg perfected it commercially, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But they had a mill in Chambersburg prior to the Civil War. It was burned during the Civil War, at which time they relocated to Middle Springs outside of Shippensburg. Again, straw paper was used primarily for packaging. So the first mill we'll talk about is Duckett's Mill. It's also known as the Pine Hill Paper Mill or Clark's Mill. And to give you an orientation here,
That's the long bottom road.
the Walnut Bottom Road is here. This is Strom Road, and this is Sandbank Road. I forget what that road is. But in any event, it's about 2 miles south and east of Leesburg, and by the time it's shown, this is an 1858 map, by the time it's shown here, it's become Clark's Mill. Now, there is published information in a book that was published years ago, an academic book on paper manufacturing, that says their mill was located in Walnut Bottom, or along the Walnut Bottom Road in Leesburg. That account is incorrect. The family that ran this paper mill later starts a plaster mill in Walnut Bottom, or along the Walnut Bottom Road in Leesburg, and that's what shows up in the map that apparently misled the authors of that book. So it's located at the intersection of Strom Road and Sandbank Road. And you can see it even today. There is a pond that probably reflects the pond that was part of the original mill complex here. There were several mills. This is the Yellow Breeches Creek. This would be the mill race, and the mill operations would have been in about this area. Interestingly, today, there's a sawmill on the property, not related in any way to the paper mill, but it's still there. Lime Box Paper Mill sits about on the site. Now, Duckett's Mill is pretty well documented in tax records. The first deed transfer that I trace it back to is 1795, and it's a 164-acre tract, and it later becomes Clark, and it's possible to take that acreage and the passage of the title and verify the location as I show. By 1793, there was a merchant mill, a grain mill, where people would bring their grain and have it milled in operation on the site, and a sawmill on the site. There can't be much power there because we're pretty high up on the Yellow Breeches. But in 1795, George Klein, in partnership with others, builds a paper mill here in 1795. George Klein was the editor of one of the Carlisle papers, the Carlisle Gazette, and he needed paper. So he goes into the paper manufacturing business. And Duckett, the individual by the name of Duckett, partners with Klein to operate this mill. It operates from 1795 to 1799, at which time it is seized by the sheriff. Duckett apparently had a little bit of financial problems and took off.
And didn't pay his taxes.
Huh?
And didn't pay his taxes.
Didn't pay his taxes, and the sheriff came and seized the property. Happened all the time back then. It's not necessary. The way business conditions were and economic conditions, not unusual. But the partnership dissolves in 1798. Klein operates it for a while, and it was later operated by John and William Buchanan. I don't know much, if anything, about them. In the 1798 tax list, they list the paper mill as a 30 by 30 foot frame building, so it wasn't a very large paper mill. But again, keep in mind that they would have a beater or an engine. It would be a tub, maybe 6 feet, 8 feet in diameter, that ground up the linen, and that slurry then passed to a tank, and a person would reach in there with a frame that had a wire on it or a screen on it, get the slurry on the screen, put it off to the side, and that would quickly dry and become paper. So it was a very primitive process. There would have been a press. How much they made and how they dried it, I don't know. But we do have, in a book of watermarks, a watermark from this era. I know it's a little bit hard to see, but it's a couple hundred years old. John William, in this case, Buchanan. So it's still on the original site, on the 164-acre site, off Strom Road, and it was referred to at this time as the Pine Hill Paper Mill. Again, very obscure, very short-lived. The Buchanans apparently operated from 1798 to 1800. When you look in the census, you see John and William's names, and John Kennedy, Alexander Johnson, William Bernard were listed as employees at the paper mill or as paper makers. So they would have been operating at the site at that time. In 1801, the deed is transferred to John Clark of Lower Allen, and the family will retain ownership of that land through at least 1858. The paper mill is still in the tax list through 1805, meaning it existed. Whether or not it's in operation or not, I don't know. There's nobody listed on the census or the tax records for 1801 or 1803 and 1805, if there was one for 1805, whatever years it was. There's nobody listed on the tax records as being paper makers, and the Buchanans and the other folks are all gone by that point. So my assumption is that it probably stopped operation in 1800, but again, no way to verify that. The building was torn down in 1807. Again, if you go there today, you can see a pond that probably has been there continuously since 1795. So that's Duckett's mill. That was a linen mill, kind of, to me, the most obscure mill that we had. Now we jump forward from 1800, 1801, the next mill that opens is in 1853 at Middlesex, and this mill was on what is now Mill Road in Middlesex. There's nothing there to see. If you go down Mill Road, and I'll show you a picture of it here in a minute, there's a vacant lot. If you look to the south, you'll see a little bit remains of the mill race, but nothing else to see, and we'll see why in a minute. One of the early operators was Ed Shryock. Shryock is related to the Shryoks of the Middle Spring Mill and the Shryoks of the family that perfected the process of manufacturing straw-based paper. So they're bringing a fairly new technology to this area, and they established a straw mill. Now, I'm not sure who owned the mill in the early years of its operation. By 1858, Penrose and Biddle, who were two Carlisle attorneys and financiers and businessmen, owned it. I suspect that there had been a bankruptcy and they got involved somehow through that chain of events, but I haven't been able to document that. By 1870, it's operated by Stauffer and Strickler. No proof, but Stauffer and Strickler are both Chambersburg names, and I suspect that they might have been in cooperation with the Shryoks or became affiliated through that Chambersburg connection. That's something that we could expand on a little bit more with title searches, perhaps. There were 15, in 1870, there were 15 male and 2 female employees, and they produced 120 tons of paper in 6 months. So, fairly good production. In today's terms, that would be 3 tractor trailer loads. So, maybe not that much in current terms, but at that time it was enough that it was financially successful. As I said, it was located in Middlesex Township, and you can see, in this case, it's Jacob Stauffer. This would be the 1872 map, and you can see the mill race. There's no evidence that I can find. You can see a little bit of this race when you go down here, but today it's pretty much an open field. This is what it looked like. This is the drying area. The paper, after it was manufactured, was pressed, and then it was hung up to dry. So this is their paper mill. That stat indicates to me that as they expanded, and I'll show you in a minute, they go to 2 paper machines. Probably the second paper machine was steam-driven, the first was water-driven. Yes, Matt?
Is that a slatted barn for?
In essence, yeah. And you see that if you look at the pictures of the mills in Mount Holly, that they had openings to let a lot of airflow in to get that paper to dry.
Does any of that exist still?
No, now all this is going, as I'll say, blows down later. When you read the history, and we're going to get into Zug's Mill, which is the most burned paper mill in Cumberland County, you couldn't ask for a more combustible situation. You have a well-ventilated building with a very high, what we call surface-to-volume ratio of fuel, and then you have paper hanging inside. Of course, that's combustible, so you throw just a little bit of fire into that room, in a couple minutes, you've got the whole building going. It's just perfect if you want to burn down a building, which, as we'll see, does happen. So the paper-making part of this process, to me, is not shown. It would be probably in this area somewhere, and that's their processing area. But a fairly good-sized building, when we consider and compare that to other mills, and the complexity of the operation is fairly good.
Is that other thing brick?
The tall thing?
The skinny thing,
Yeah, the skinny thing, I think that would be a smokestack possibly for a steam.
but made of brick at that high at that time.
Oh, yeah, that's no problem.
No problem.
No problem. Yeah, that's relatively easy. They would build scaffolding and go up there. Which isn't to say that one or two people won't die in the process, but it was easy to do. In 1872, as we said, Stauffer and now David Miller's involved. The mill itself was 52 by 100 feet with another wing 33 by 100, which would seem to match up with this. And again, all frame construction. At that point, they're making 3 tons of paper per day, which is a pretty significant rate of paper. In 1873, it sold to Whitmer, Brenneman and Company. They're local people, and those names still show up in the Middlesex and Kingstown area. 1876, it sold to Abram Whitmer, who was a local businessman. And at this point, they have 2 engines, one that's capable of processing 400 pounds at a time, another 300 pounds, and a cylindrical paper machine. At this point in time, it's still all water powered. And this is what a cylindrical machine would look like. You have the vat of slurry here. As this wheel turns, it captures fibers, which it starts to make the paper, and then that wet is drawn off, and it very quickly starts to dry. This would be a drying cylinder, and then it gets rolled up into the paper. This is a fairly primitive machine, as opposed to the 4-dryer machines that I talk more extensively about in the Holly Mills program. We're not so much worried about quality of the paper here, or the smoothness of the paper, or putting any coatings on it. We're making a cheap wrapping paper. Or we're going to make cardboard out of it that's going to be used in packaging. So it's a less sophisticated machine than the other mills have when we talk about them. But just to give you an idea, in this particular case, it would be water powered, and it looks like that would be your point of propulsion at that point in time. There's a good bit of power in Middlesex. If you ever get down there and look at the fall, the water that's coming through there was a good bit of power there. It operates into the 1880s. Business conditions were bad in 1884, and it had slowed down. By that point, they had 2 paper machines that were making 4,000 pounds of paper, or 2 tons of paper a day. Production ends in 1895, and the mill blew down in 1893. So they didn't maintain the building. There was no salvage value to it. It blew down. If you go down there today, it's just a vacant lot, as you can see here on the corner. So that's where that one was taken. Again, that's open. There's a township park across the creek. You can go over and look back, and again, there's no evidence of any of the races or any of the building operation at that point. So our next mill is Zug's Mill, and this one's kind of interesting to me. This is located on Lander Lane, and you can see Lander Lane, Ladner Lane. Route 34 would be over here. Hollyhurst is here. This is now bed and breakfast, 123 bed and breakfast. And what they show as Mountain Creek on Google Maps is actually the race for Zug's paper mill. And that was, I think, a Zug from Mount Holly that got involved in the paper business. A little hard to tell. There's 2 wealthy Zugs, one in Carlisle, one in Mount Holly, or 2 families in each town at this point in time. So it's a little hard to tell. This is a LiDAR image. This building corresponds here, just to get your bearings, but you can see the creek, you can see the mill race comes in. There was a pond here, Here's the pond, and then you can see the tail race of the mill, still very visible, and the original creek bed over here. They changed places with time, so the two houses. The mill would have been located, from all indications, in this area. So not much to see. There's very little left. There are some banks out there, as I'll talk about. We have found some bricks out there, and you can see the pits where the turbine was, where the turbines will. Started in 1851. It appears it started as a straw mill, and it was probably owned by the Zug family from Mount Holly Springs. It burns in 1856. They rebuilt it as a straw mill. It's destroyed by fire in 1859. It's rebuilt. It's seized by the sheriff in 1861. Nobody's making any money on this, right? And then it's sold to William Mullen. It burns again in 1866. Now, one thing that's interesting with the 1866 account, by this time, William B. Mullen is involved. William B. Mullen is a major paper maker in Mount Holly at this point in time, and has a major mill where the sheets is. By all indications, the Zug mill had been rebuilt. It burns in 1866, and Mullen built an addition or an adjoining mill at the site. I suspect that they were probably interconnected. There's no record that I can find. But they had, at this time, converted to rag paper production, as was Mullen's mill at Mount Holly. They had 3 rag engines and a 66-inch 4-driver machine, meaning they could make paper 5 feet 6 inches wide. And Mullen was known for the quality of his paper. They also made what was called a security paper. Back in the day, at this point in time, everything is written on paper, and if you wrote a check, it was on paper, much as we did later. But their paper was designed in such a way that if you tried to erase or alter a signature or an amount, it damaged the paper and it became very clear. So they called it security paper, and they were quite famous for it, and they supplied a lot of paper to the state. Mullen had some political connections. So he's expanding his business and operating, as I say, with 3 rag engines and a 66-inch 4-driver machine. So this is a pretty elaborate, high-quality paper mill at this time, and it's fairly large. They're using 2 water wheels. Now, to clarify what for water wheel they're using, and it is documented that they used a turbine on this type of manufacturer. If you go to the mill at Big Springs, you see an overshot wooden water wheel. Not horribly efficient compared to a turbine. In the turbine, water comes down a shaft or a chute and is discharged and turns paddles and then goes out the bottom, so that it would be surrounded by water. And as the water goes through, it turns the shaft. This is the shaft coming out. This device would control the degree of angle on the paddles. You could shut it down entirely, or you can open it full depending on what the water flow is and how much energy you're trying to make. That's probably the equivalent of maybe 20 to 30 horsepower under optimum conditions. So they're, at that point in time, using 2 of these wheels. When you go out there today, and it's private property and posted, you can only go on it with permission, there is evidence of the 2 pits where the turbine wheels were. But most everything else has been salvaged and destroyed because the turbines are long gone. So this continues to operate. In 1872, William B. Mullen has died, and they sell to William A. and A. Foster Mullen and Isaac Parker. That family operates mills at Zug's, and they also operate the mill at what is now Sheets in Mount Holly for a number of years. Zug's mill again burns for the 4th time in 1872, and it's not rebuilt. That was the end of Zug's mill, and the brick was later reclaimed and used by a contractor or builder in Boiling Springs, where I don't know. And this would be the view of Ladner Lane and the crossing of the creek. The mill would have set to the south, and this is the evidence. You can see embankments on both sides. It would have been a fairly large mill pond. That's been altered a little bit in the last year or 2 by the current owner. I don't understand their plans for it, but they want to reintroduce water into this portion of what had been the raceway.
They're probably going to develop it.
I don't think so.
They're developing every inch of South Middlesex.
The next one is the Big Spring Paper Mill, and this one kind of surprised me. It was, at one time, a grain mill or a grist mill. And to get your bearings, this is the 1872 map, keeping in mind that in 1914 to 1917, this whole area of Newville was extensively redeveloped when they straightened the railroad. So what we're looking at is the early arrangement of the railroad in Newville. But in any event, this is Big Spring Road as it existed in 1872, and it's still very similar. The mill was right here. This would be the road, you go back into the Green Ridge Retirement Center along the creek, and just parallel to it. Again, the roadway and the area has changed a good bit since then, but this was the Big Spring Paper Mill in 1872. The best way to see this site is to walk on the rail trail, and if you go down to where the old hotel was, that building still exists. This depot was later replaced, but in any event, the hotel building still stands, the ribbon mill is in this area. If you're on the rail trail, you can look down and see very clearly where the mill was. It's not there anymore, but you can see the area where it was. Again, this has been a grist mill or a grain processing mill that the All Brothers converted into a paper mill. After their operation, it's converted into a knitting mill. It exists in this state for a couple months and then it burns down. But this would have been the building after it's converted to a knitting mill, just to give you an idea of what that structure looked like. That too would have been a rather spectacular fire, considering there's no fire department per se and no water supply. It was McFarland's Mill, converted in 1857 to make paper. Again, 40 by 60, 4 stories high. We can see that here. In 1867, it now starts to trade as John All and Son. John A. All was the father of Daniel and Peter, the two local entrepreneurs. It was water powered, it made about a ton of paper a day. It was a straw mill. In 1878, it had 2 engines where they broke down the fiber and one 48-inch cylindrical machine. So not a sizable operation, none of these were, but nonetheless they made paper. It operated intermittently from 1878 to 1884, some due to business conditions. The Alls also go through a bankruptcy at this point, and they converted back to a grist mill in 1884. It operates as a grist mill from 1884 to 1898. It becomes the Newville Knitting Mill, and it operates until June of that year when it burns down and is not rebuilt. So rather intermittent. And again, you can see that the location today is where we would go back to Greenridge Village, and the mill location would have been in that area. So again, yes?
How were they drawing the water? Did they have a race?
I think in this particular case, they would have had probably the pond.
Okay, just out of the pond, all right.
Yeah. Now, what I see here, Matt, would be that the big spring itself would have been dammed up to make that. I'm not sure if that's a footbridge. It's not a race, but there's no. So I'm guessing that the wheels would have been probably right in that area. And again, the turbine wheel would have been possible to bring the turbine wheel in here, maybe via pipe, or maybe via a race that's not even shown, and then it would drop down and go through and come out downstream. So I'd have to go there and try and figure it out a little better to see what the drop actually was and how they might have done it. I didn't see anything when I looked at the LiDAR image that clarified that. That might be a good field trip someday. Because again, you can't really see much here. The only thing that might be a clue is this particular opening and water over here. But the picture, unfortunately, I can't tell what that is.
There's no trace of that up there.
Yeah. No, it's all going. Because the mill at Building Springs had a similar situation where some prior mill races were blocked out, and that might have been done though when they electrified that rather than converting it to a turbine. And I don't know if we have any good pictures of McFarland's that would explain that any better. I don't. It would be worth a look. Good questions. But as far as I know, it was all water powered, and they never got to steam power. Another one, this is Shryock's mill at Middle Spring, was a straw mill, and this would be what they're calling the Newburgh Road, which you can see on the modern LiDAR image, and it's set along the creek. It would have been in this particular area. We'll see when there's a picture comes up later, the church itself is over here. So the paper mill would have been, and the church is not there anymore, I don't think, across the street from the cemetery toward the creek. And in this case, it's very clear that there's two races going in there to power their machines. And they also later go steam powered.
It's interesting they used the word papyrus on that one.
Yeah, and
Papyrus,
for
yeah.
a while they did call it the papyrus mill. They traded it as that.
That's the word.
Yeah. This one too, it trades under various names. The Shryock's family of Chambersburg, first and second generation, were very involved in it. They also own mills in Massachusetts and one in Downingtown, Pennsylvania. And when this one burns, they go to those mills to continue their business. The Monmouth Mill was in Chambersburg. It was burned in 1864 by the rebels, and then they built what they called the Papyrus Mill at Middle Spring in 1866. After the war, they go into the production of straw board. They had one engine and one paper machine, used two turbine wheels, which we saw 2 raceways, and they were sending 2 rail cars per week to Philadelphia. So a rail car at that point might have held 10 to 20 tons. So they were doing somewhere between 20 and 40 tons a week. That's a pretty sizable operation compared to the others that we saw. 1878, they go to the point that they have 75 employees. By 1880, they're using steam power. Now, part of what we know about these mills and how they work is from accident reports, and a little bit that we do know about the workers also come from accident reports. The vats where they process the fiber were heated to a high temperature, and they have a couple of accounts where workmen fall in and are pretty severely burned or die when that happens. We also know that they had black employees, and it tended to be the black employees that worked in the worst jobs, which is typical of everything we see at this point in time. So there's a little bit more published about Shryock. It was outside of Shippensburg. The paper paid a good bit of attention to it and wrote about it, more than these other mills, which were much more remote. By 1880, they were using steam power, and again, that would equate for some of the size of their production. This is what their mill looked like. Here's a flume that carries water, and this would be a production area. You can see the smokestack. This is probably another production area, the boiler house that would have made the steam to power the machinery in the plant, also used for drying. And again, we see the drying shed. And again, if we could see that a little bit better, those are probably slotted buildings with ventilation, so that it's, again, highly combustible. And that proves to be the case. July 4th, 1898, big fire. The Shippensburg paper writes a very detailed account about it. Always thought it was started by lightning, but some other people thought it was started by fireworks. And the plant was not rebuilt. They had started to use their paper at the Shippensburg odorless egg crate factory in Shippensburg, and that would become their big market. That plant stayed in operation, but was supplied by their other mills. Again, if you go there today, it's an open field. So that's the 5th of 6 mills, and there's not a trace of any of these operations left if you go out there today and look.
Are Shryock's Germans? Or
I don't know, does anybody know Shryock? Is that a German name?
It sounds like it.
Yeah, it would sound like, I don't think it's Irish. But, or perhaps English, I don't know. Good
I don't
question.
know either, because you don't usually hear the rock on the end. In German, the original German would be SCH. The C was dropped a lot here.
Okay.
It used to be SCH. Always, but
I have a friend I can contact, now that
I don't know.
Mr. Burnett.
It's not a common name, but there's I think when I taught, I had a Harry Mullen.
Okay,
He used to teach us how to make
okay.
He's still living.
Oh, okay.
Probably a descendant.
Probably, and it's,
Harry Mullen.
Mullen is spelled 2 ways, M-U-L-L-E-N and M-U-L-L-I-N, and they all appear the same, and the same guy will be spelled 2 different ways, 3 different ways, and even sometimes when they write their own names, I think they do that. So the final one we talk about, again, kind of a short program, but it's obscure, so there's not much to talk about, is the Trindle Springs paper mill. And a little bit of confusion on this one, but I'll try and set it. This would be the Trindle Road coming out of Mechanicsburg. This is Church Street, and I'm drawing a blank on the name of this street. It's the one that goes back, that's not Church, Pleasant View.
Is this heading?
This would be, here's the Trindle Road, and we're headed north toward Pleasant View. If you turn right, Fry Communications has a big factory in this area now. And where you cross the railroad tracks, we're following Trindle Springs, which, when you think about a paper mill in Trindle Springs, as you look at it today, it's kind of a small creek and a little bit of a floodplain. And it's a crummy, dirty-looking place. You wouldn't think there was ever anything there. But the confusing part to me comes in how it's pictured. And this shows the road to Trindle Springs Church, which in modern terms would be right here. So the paper mill would be in this area. But when you look at this map, it places it up closer to the railroad track, which is an entirely different area. So I'm not exactly sure whether this was located at the northeast corner of Church and Pleasant View, or if it was located closer to the railroad track. And I'll show pictures of both locations. But there are, this is from a road survey in 1868, sketches here. This is the Cumberland Valley Railroad. This would be what I would assume to be Church Road, as opposed to, it might be this crossroad. And Pleasant View, Trindle Road would be down here, and this shows the mill. Now, this mill is kind of interesting. It starts as a local operation, and then it becomes a stock company that's a little more dispersed, and it has some elements of fraud toward the end. But in any event, this is the current configuration. These are properties from Fry. There's some housing developments. Based on the sketches and the evidence of the railroad siding, it would be the northern location seems a little more likely to me, but it's hard to say. Would have been either where that barn is on the right or a little farther north on the right. So as early as 1872, there was a grist mill here, perhaps earlier, or 1782, I'm sorry, 1782. By 1886, it's trading as Brandt and Isley and Company, and it's stated that it was converted to a steam paper mill in 1866. So a year or two after the Civil War, not long after, it's conveyed to the Trindle Spring Paper Company. And this is a stock certificate in the collection of the Mechanicsburg Museum Association, and it becomes a source of the only known image of the paper mill in a minute. It was local ownership, but owned by a stock company. And here's what we can see of the mill. This view, as I understand it, this would be the Cumberland Valley Railroad. So this is looking south. There's the siding that comes in that we saw before, and this would be the paper mill. This would be a brick building and wood for the remainder, probably a little bit of brick there. It's a fairly sizable building and a fairly sizable operation. They invested quite heavily into the operation. They sold stock, and they sold stock in a wide area, and for some reason a lot was sold in the Lebanon County area. So there was some connection that I haven't been able to establish there. It was a straw mill, as I said, probably started around 1866. It's idle in 1873. It's sold in foreclosure in 1876, at which time it's described as a steam mill producing 10 tons a day. So if we go back to that image and we talk about the size of the plant, they invested very heavily to build a high-capacity building and high-capacity production. The problem was that they had put $150,000 to $180,000 in it, and when it was foreclosed, they only got $30,000 for it. So a lot of people quickly lost a lot of money. In 1879, it's purchased by a local individual, Robert Corman. He attempts to operate the paper mill. It fails, and by 1881, it's converted into tobacco storage. I'm assuming, and I do see a little evidence, that the tobacco they stored was grown locally, which kind of surprised me because I had not heard of that to any extent before. And he operates it for a number of years as tobacco storage. And in 1900, the machinery is removed, and I don't know what subsequently happens to the building, but it ended operation in 1881. And that's the point now at which we start to make paper out of wood fiber, and the straw paper starts to have lesser value. So I think that impacted them, that conversion into different paper. And of course, the 1870s were a very difficult time financially from 1873 to really 1879. So he got hit from a couple different directions. And again, in 1879 or 1881, it's done. So Corman got 2 years out of it. A lot of people were left hanging. Corman bought it, and he got some favorable publicity if he wrote the accounts, and if other people wrote the accounts, they didn't think as highly of him from a business perspective. So kind of interesting. But Corman's still a common name in the Mechanicsburg area. So that's what I have on the obscure paper mills or the lesser known paper mills. I realize it's not a long program, but it's hard to make a long program out of a small story.